Welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, which is a partnership between War on the Rocks and the University of Texas at Austin. My name is Rick Landgraf, the managing editor of TNSR. My guest today is Chuck Ziegler, who is a professor of political science and university scholar at the University of Louisville, the faculty director of the Grawemeyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order, and president of the American Committees on Foreign Relations. His latest book is Russia in the Pacific, The Quest for Great Power Recognition. Chuck, welcome to the show today.
Thanks, Rick. It's great to be with you.
Today we're going to talk about your TNSR article entitled Filling the Void Left by Great Power Retrenchment, Russia, Central Asia, and the U.S. Withdrawal from Afghanistan, which is up on our site now at tnsr.org and included in the fall 2024 print issue of the journal. Chuck, before we get into your motivation for writing this piece, can you please lay out and articulate the main argument for our audience?
Sure. I think with the second invasion of Ukraine that took place in February 2022, there was a lot of speculation about both Russia's motivations and capabilities. In terms of motivations, was Putin determined to recreate the entire Soviet Union, that is, reabsorb the 14 non-Russian states that had seceded from the USSR? And if he has more limited objectives, what are they? Well, my central argument in the piece is that Russia under Putin is basically a neo-imperial state, but in a limited sense. That is, he may not want to reestablish the entire Soviet Union, but he does regard the breakup of the USSR as a catastrophe. He said as much a number of years ago. And I think that he seeks to control those territories that are part of what's called in Russia now the Russian world, or Ruski Mir in Russian. And that's, as conceived by the Kremlin and some Russian intellectuals and nationalists. The idea of this Russian world is that it includes those areas where there are ethnic Russians and also Russian speakers, where they live or where Russian culture dominates. And that would include, of course, Ukraine, Belarus, parts of Estonia, Latvia, Moldova, and the northern part of Kazakhstan. So if my read on Putin's motives is correct, this has certain implications. First, it implies the sovereignty of these states is dependent on the goodwill of the Kremlin. The Russian perspective is that of a great power, and they believe that smaller powers must often make concessions to the more powerful. Very much a realist perspective. And so in the article, I suggest that while Russia has strong historical and cultural ties to the Central Asian states, the blatant violation of Ukraine's sovereignty has heightened unease there regarding Russia's hegemonic position in the region. If we think back in 2001, after 9/11, Putin had accepted and even supported the U.S. campaign to oust the Taliban and capture Osama bin Laden, since that coincided with his counterterrorism agenda in Chechnya and elsewhere. But after the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, those in the Kremlin worried that the U.S. would stay on indefinitely in Central Asia. We had bases there in Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan, and then overflight rights with other states there. So then with the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan in August of 2021, Russia logically was poised to strengthen its hegemonic position in the Central Asian theater. But then Putin decided to invade Ukraine, which I think confirmed his neo-imperial ambitions. And this led to a limited pushback among Central Asian leaders, which I think is really a fascinating development. In Belarus, we see by contrast, Alexander Lukashenko there decided to essentially become a vassal of Russia's rather than resist the way Ukraine did.
Right. And in your piece, you talk about how the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan ending in August 2021 and how this presented an opportunity for Russia to reassert itself in the Central Asian region. Can you talk a little bit about those opportunities?
Theoretically, the idea is that when a dominant power decides to retrench, that leaves a bit of a vacuum and opportunities either for other great powers to move in, and that was sort of the theoretical structure I used in the paper, or the retrenching power may designate certain successor states, regional actors. It's sort of in line with the Nixon doctrine, if you will, when we were trying to draw down Vietnam and task regional leaders with greater responsibility. My suggestion in the paper was that really the only two viable successor states would have been India, which has significant interest in Afghanistan, and Turkey, which has significant interest in the post-Soviet Central Asian region. But after looking at it, it seems like neither country really had the capabilities to step in as a successor state. But for that matter, the U.S. did not really adopt this sort of approach either. It didn't, I think for various reasons, didn't take either India or Turkey seriously as a successor state.
I want to turn now to the 5 Central Asian countries and bring up how they have responded not only to the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan after being in Afghanistan for 2 decades, but also to Russia's full-scale assault on Ukraine. So 2-part question here. First, in your view, how have the Central Asian countries, both as a group, but also individually, because they obviously each have agency, how have they reacted to the Afghan withdrawal? And also, how have they responded to Russia's war against Ukraine?
Well, in terms of the reactions to the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, I think there was quite a bit of unease there with the Taliban. Maybe not so much the Taliban, since it tends to be a nationalist organization in Afghanistan. But the idea that given the chaos, the potential for fragmentation there, the rise of groups like ISIS, Khorasan, that the Central Asian states would see some spillover in the form of terrorism by ISIS-K. Tajikistan in particular is worried about this, but the other Central Asian states are too. So I think that was the initial worry. Some of that may have died down. We see now that several of the states, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, have taken the Taliban off their list of terrorist organizations. There are a few minor outreaches to Afghanistan, though none of the 5 Central Asian states have reestablished full diplomatic relations with them. Another thing that the Central Asian states have done is to, if you will, even expand on their, what they call a multi-vector diplomacy or multi-vector foreign policies, which they've articulated for quite a long time. And that is, I think, sends a signal that they don't want to be subservient to any of the great powers, not to Russia, not to China, not to the United States, not to Europeans, but they want to balance off the great powers to maximize their ability to maneuver. And it's really interesting, and I detail some of this in the paper, and there are other things that have happened since it was published, that Central Asians, they did not support Russia wholeheartedly, even though they have close historical, political, economic, cultural connections to Russia. There was really some pushback and criticism, even from weak states like Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, which are heavily dependent on Russia for their security. Kazakhstan had always pretty much been in sync with Russia under former President Nazarbayev. But it was interesting that shortly after the war, at a public forum in St. Petersburg with Putin and the chief editor of RT, the current president, Tokayev, publicly refused to recognize Russia's quasi-states in the Donbass, as he called them. And he also mentioned South Ossetia and Abkhazia in Georgia to make the point that Kazakhstan wasn't ready to see the sort of state-sponsored fragmentation. And this was only a few months after Russia led a CSTO contingent to Almaty to help support Tokayev when his rule was threatened by mass demonstrations. So I think this is really interesting. And then, as I mentioned, just very recently, we see, for example, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz going to Astana just a few days ago to meet with all Central Asian presidents. And while the Central Asians wouldn't back the European position on Ukraine, they're more than willing to work with the Europeans and provide an alternate source of oil and gas, since supplies have been cut back so much from Russia. Central Asians are also holding discussions on regional integration without Russian participation. And in July of this year, the Central Asians, together with Azerbaijan, had military exercises in Western Kazakhstan. And this is, I think, sort of this notion of a pan-Turkic organization of Turkic states. And it's striking that this is, in a way, a civilizational response to what has been Russia's civilizational approach in the form of the Russian world.
You talk about in the piece how Russia has tried to instrumentalize regional security organizations. Earlier you mentioned the CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, but there's also the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that Russia co-leads with China. How has Russia tried to use these organizations to advance its own agenda, and to what effect has it had so far?
Well, with the CSTO, Russia clearly is the dominant power there. The CSTO hasn't done a whole lot other than hold exercises, military exercises from time to time. The one time it was used was there in January of 2022 to help Tokayev retain power. And the Russians were really insulted when Tokayev then turns around and refuses to recognize their little statelets there in Ukraine. Azerbaijan and Armenia. Armenia was a member of the CSTO, and the CSTO did virtually nothing to help Armenia. And Armenia was talking about withdrawing, basically, I think, has written off the CSTO as an effective organization. Again, this drives the Russians crazy. They're not very happy about that. So I think that the sense is that the CSTO doesn't really do much, or can't do very much, or won't do much under Russian leadership to help security in Central Asia. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, of course, Russia is a co-leader with China on that. And it's recently been expanded dramatically, including countries, including India, Pakistan, Iran. And, as we know, when organizations get larger and larger, they have much greater difficulty acting collectively. And given China's important role there, it's doubtful that the Shanghai Cooperation Organization can do much more than maybe provide some help on anti-terrorist exercises through the RATS, as it's called, or to organize economic cooperation. So I don't see either of these organizations as being terribly effective in helping Russia retain hegemony in Central Asia.
And you conclude in the piece with talking about how, with the absence of the United States from Central Asia and from Afghanistan in particular, obviously, and with Russia really failing to take advantage of this opportunity, in large part because of the reactions of Central Asian states to the Ukraine invasion, that China is poised to take advantage in this situation. Can you talk a little bit about how China has engaged the Central Asian states together as a group and then also individually, and where you see China trying to assert its own power and influence in the area moving forward?
Well, to this point, most of China's interest has been economic, because Central Asia is a critical part of the Belt and Road Initiative. And even though that's got some problems now, it's still very important for Beijing. The Central Asians themselves certainly want to get on the Belt and Road Initiative bandwagon, benefit from that, since these are landlocked countries, a long way from many other markets. It doesn't mean that they totally trust China. There are, small Chinatowns in different parts of Central Asia, different cities. There is, on the one hand, a respect that the Chinese can get things done. They can build infrastructure. They can put roads, tunnels, ports, that sort of thing together pretty quickly. But they're also very wary of China, which is, throwing its weight around in many parts of the world now. And a sense that, there are these small countries. The biggest, Uzbekistan, has not many more than 30 million people. And so there's a feeling that they can easily be overwhelmed by the Chinese. And when the Chinese do these projects on oil or infrastructure and so on, building a light rail system in Astana, for example, in Kazakhstan, they bring in Chinese workers often rather than employing locals. And if they do employ locals, they don't treat them very well. So I would say yes, with Russia's departure, there is more of an opening for China. The Chinese are welcomed by the leaders, but there is still, I think, a sense of unease because none of these countries want to give up their sovereignty. Again, they were colonized by Russia and by the Soviet Union. They're resisting neocolonialism by Russia. They don't want to subject themselves to colonialism in any form, I think, by the Chinese.
What kind of reaction has this piece received so far? I know it was published online on our site in early August. We're speaking now and toward the end of September. What kind of reaction has it gotten?
Well, it is pretty new, but I've gotten some good feedback from different colleagues, both at the University of Louisville and at other universities. I mean, one of my colleagues at U of L who specializes in religion and politics wondered whether Central Asia might be less important to Russia than, say, either Ukraine or Belarus, since the Orthodox Church now is so central to Russia's identity, and Orthodoxy has been a source of contention in Ukraine. And he thought that this could be why Russian and Chinese interests have not clashed in Central Asia the way that Russian and European interests have clashed over Ukraine. I thought this was interesting. He also thought it would be neat to develop more the idea of the nascent nationalism in Central Asia, something I've already talked about here. And it is fascinating that we see a resurgence of the indigenous languages, even in places like Kazakhstan, which was heavily Russified in the Soviet period, where many Kazakhs spoke great Russian, but very poor Kazakh. And even Kazakhs now in their 50s and 60s are relearning their language. They're relearning their history. Russians, I think I mentioned in the piece that they're a little peeved that the Russian language and culture are not getting sufficient attention in Central Asia. So that was one interesting reaction, I thought. Another colleague from New York asked about what I thought the drift in Central Asia would be when we get a new generation of leadership there, because most of the leaders are pretty much still old Soviet-style leaders. I mean, they're authoritarian. They have this Soviet mentality. Already, though, we can see them becoming more nationalistic, somewhat more Islamic, although they really try to control religion there. So a question worth thinking about is, what will this mean when we get a new generation in of Central Asians into leadership who have studied Chinese and English rather than Russian, and who don't look to Russia as a key source of inspiration. Another colleague on the West Coast, she's a specialist on South Asia and Russia. She thought, and this is really interesting and probably worth exploring more too, is that the U.S. very likely squandered an opportunity to work more closely with India on achieving its objectives in Afghanistan. And I have that section in there on India as a possible successor state, but it does seem that we never really considered encouraging India to take a greater role. And India is very interested in Afghanistan, given its confrontation with Pakistan and the possibility of again, extremists from Pakistan, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, ISIS-K, whatever, maybe conducting terrorist raids within India. So these are some of the interesting comments that I've gotten from colleagues, as I said, both here at U of L and elsewhere.
The aim of our journal, TNSR, is to have articles published in this journal that ultimately end up not only the desks of decision makers and to be cited as foundational research, but also on university syllabi as well. Are you asking some of these questions of your students, questions that you ask in this piece, and how are you integrating your own research, this being part of it in your work there at U of L?
Well, to be honest, I'm not using the article at present, given the specific courses I'm teaching at the University of Louisville. I'm not doing anything on Russia or Central Asia this semester. But I am certainly working the ideas into my discussions. I do a course on American foreign policy, so it does have some relevance there when we talk about the withdrawal from Afghanistan. A colleague of mine has used the article I published in TNSR about, 4 years back now, and he said that it worked well for him. This was an article on U.S.-Russia relations and the security dilemma. So he said it seemed to work pretty well for him. There's several reasons why I really like TNSR, and that is because you publish articles that are really solid, but are much more readable than many that you find in political science or international relations journals. So I would urge you to keep up the good work there. And I know TNSR has a very good reputation in the field.
Well, Chuck, it's been a pleasure speaking with you today. Thank you so much for being on Horns of the Llama.
Thank you, Rick. Enjoyed it very much. And I'll sign off for now.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. Do not forget to read the Texas National Security Review, which you can find at tnsr.org.